Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. And Jeremy, thank you for taking the time to be with us and illuminate us and be in MAHA School. I've got a proper introduction for you, and this is going to be recorded, and we'll be able to share it far and wide. But Jeremy R. Hammond, you are an investigative journalist and the author of The War on Informed Consent and The Obstacle to Peace, among other titles. You write about health freedom topics as well as foreign and economic policy, and you describe yourself as an author whose work focuses on exposing deceitful propaganda, serving to manufacture consent for harmful government policies. So thank you for being here. I've got a number of questions for you, but it's good to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity to connect with your community. Appreciate it.
We appreciate you very much. Thank you for the work you did during COVID. That was really important work, and you were one of the courageous people who were dealing with it. So, Noam Chomsky reviewed one of your books. He said how carefully documented and thoughtfully studied your analysis is of the Middle Eastern conflict. Bobby Kennedy said that he relies on your judgment for a lot of very complex issues. You've had diplomats say that your book, Obstacle to Peace, is a bridge to a real peace process. So you are able to analyze situations and package the information that you find into really palatable articles and books and things that actually influence culture. So your superpowers, your research skills, and then effectively communicating what you find. So this conversation, my audience is content creators, it's thought leaders, it's people who are trying to change the culture. And so you've done this very winsomely. And I guess the first question I have for you is, why is the media not doing their job? Why do regular people have to step in and fix things?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with. Yeah, as I say, I mean, if you go to my website and I kind of have a tagline describing what I do, and I say that what I do is I expose uh, dangerous propaganda that serves to manufacture consent for criminal government policies. And so I'm borrowing that phrase, manufacturing consent, from the book by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media. And they in turn were borrowing it from Walter Lippmann and so on. But the idea that they wrote in that book is obviously in a communist regime or a totalitarian government where the media is literally controlled by the state. It's obvious that the media would serve a propaganda function. Americans have this belief that we have a free press that's independent from the government. And their book kind of details why it's not the case that therefore the media do not fulfill a propaganda function in service to the state. And so they detail all kinds of what they describe as filters and influences on the media that result in the media performing this propaganda function with case study after case study, mainly focused on foreign policy issues. But it's the same with domestic issues. If you want to look at economic questions or the so-called public health policies, the media, by and large, fulfill this propaganda function. And some of the examples they give in the book, the Manufacturing Consent, are things like the advertising and the influence of advertising. And of course, we're all familiar with the influence of big pharma advertising on the media and so on. But really, in my own analysis, and I would kind of modify the analysis that they did in the book. There's another factor here at play, which I describe as the state religion. And we're all indoctrinated since our early childhood into the belief that the government is this benevolent force, that we need the government to take care of us, that we need the government intervening in every aspect of our lives because we can't manage our own lives and make proper decisions for ourselves and for our families without the government telling us what to do. And so there's this indoctrination, and of course, journalists are not immune to that. So I think, the question of individual journalists, they all have their own biases. And of course, there's the hierarchical, structural types of biases in terms of, the editing, who's doing the editing and who's deciding what can or cannot be published and the ownership of media companies and so on. But also right down to the individual level of journalists who will, they'll self-censor. They have their own confirmation biases where they'll accept facts and report facts that serve a predetermined political agenda, whereas they will omit information that contradicts that narrative. And so there's just this bias within the media, right down to the level of individual journalists who are indoctrinated into the state religion, into this belief system, about the benevolence of the U.S. government. And the Iraq War is really how I got started with journalism, speaking out against the claim that Iraq had these weapons of mass destruction and these operative ties to Al Qaeda, and we needed to invade Iraq, to destroy its weapons programs and make the world safe from Iraqi WMD. And I was saying before the war, months and months before the war, I was saying that no, the government is lying. There's no evidence that Iraq, in fact, the evidence indicates that Iraq was disarmed in the early 90s, which later on proved to be true. Of course, the CDC came on and admitted after they destroyed Iraq, that yes, Iraq was fundamentally disarmed in 1991 by the UN weapons inspectors. So I was right about that. And the way I was able to do that was just, the type of analysis that I like to do where, number one, you have to get your information from a wide variety of sources. If you're not doing that, if you're limiting yourself to just one perspective, one source, one perspective, you're really missing out on the opportunity to even be aware that there are other points of view. And that's a big problem. There's so many other points of view. And a lot of times they limit themselves in what they consume to a very narrow range of perspectives. And so the first piece of advice that I have for people is just to make sure you're getting your information from a huge variety of sources. For example, if I'm going to, research a question related to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is one of the topics that I'm most well known for. I'm going to get information from the New York Times and the Washington Post and other U.S. mainstream media, of course. But I'm also going to, I'm going to look at what is Al Jazeera saying, or Middle East Eye, or some of those publications, Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, Antiwar.com. The Libertarian Institute, where I'm a research fellow. But also, what is the Israeli media saying? This is really critical because a lot of times, you have the U.S., the New York Times is terrible in terms of the propagandistic nature of its reporting. And you can go to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and get the truth. Or you can read Jerusalem Post and other sources like that. And so you really want to get as many perspectives as you can. And then, of course, you're going to have all kinds of conflicts between the information. There's going to be contradictions. They're going to be contradicting each other. And one source is going to claim one thing, another source is going to claim something else. And those two claims are irreconcilable, where they can't both be true in that sense. And so that's where you have to do kind of this analysis of, okay, let's start with what's uncontroversial. What do all the sources agree on? And all perspectives seem to agree on something. And you can establish that those things are probably that's where you can start is the framework, the basis, that's what's factual. And then you start looking into, okay, where do they differ and how do they contradict each other? And so then you need to really kind of do like an assessment of the source's biases.
Right.
And then when it comes to U.S. mainstream media, to get back to the question is, that is the bias is that there's this state religion where people have this belief in the benevolence of the U.S. government, and that filters through to the mainstream media reporting in the United States.
Thank you. That was actually my next question, which you just beautifully answered, was how do we curate our content feed, our news feed, in order to get a proper assessment so we can diagnose the situation? And it seems like you rely a lot on your own critical thinking skills. Does it frustrate you to tears how some people just put CNN on and let them do the thinking for them?
Yeah, that's a huge problem is people allow other sources to tell them what their opinions ought to be. And we really have to think for ourselves and draw our own conclusions. And that requires, it requires, for example, going specifically to sources that express perspectives and points of view that you disagree with. And because we all have to try to overcome that confirmation bias that I was talking about earlier, that journalists are not immune to. And so we need to be aware of our own confirmation biases. And you just start with, okay, this is what I believe, but let me challenge my beliefs. Let me see what other people are saying who are arguing something against what I believe, and see if you can withstand their arguments. If you can go to a source that is like opposing your point of view and read their arguments, and if you can address each and every single one of those arguments and point out why those arguments do not dispute your point of view, why they're false. Either the information is factually incorrect that they're claiming, and you can show how it's false, or they're using logical fallacies and they're drawing conclusions that don't logically follow from their premises. Okay. So if you can, and that's a really good exercise to get into the habit of doing on a regular basis, is going to those sources that have points of view that are directly opposed to yours, and then learning what are those arguments. And that's something I try to do with my work and my writing, is and that's one of the things I think that makes it stand out from other writers, is that I really go to great lengths to anticipate all counter arguments.
Yes, you
So
do.
when I write a piece, I'm anticipating, okay, I know people are going to attack me for this. I know they're going to come after me and claim I'm an anti-vaxxer who was anti-science, and I'm dismissing the evidence, and so on and so forth. And I want my articles to be completely, as strong as possible, where they're really airtight, and where my conclusions it'd be really hard to argue against my conclusions, because I've got my facts so well documented, and I'm absolutely accurate in everything I'm saying. I try really hard to be as accurate as possible, and then also just anticipating those objections and arguments, and so I kind of preempt any objections in the article, which is one of the reasons I do quite long form content. Is not unusual for me to publish articles 10,000 words or more, which is a lot of people kind of consume 800,000 word articles, and my articles are more in depth. But the
Mhm.
way I like to think of it is, it might take you an hour to read one of my articles as opposed to 10 minutes to read someone else's. Um, but I'm saving you in that 1 hour of time. I'm giving you hundreds of hours of research.
Yeah.
And I'm putting it together in a way that it's relatively easy to consume. And so I'm hopefully doing my readers a favor by producing this type of in-depth material that, again, and don't take my word for stuff, check my sources. If you doubt something, if you don't believe it, by all means, check the source that I cite and verify it for yourself. And this is critically important. This is another absolutely essential step when you're researching and consuming news media, is to check sources, because so many times you'll see a New York Times or some other mainstream source claiming something, and then you check their source, and they're completely mischaracterizing their own cited sources. And a great example of that is, I wrote a four-part series on the flu shot fraud, everything you ever wanted to know about influenza vaccines that the CDC didn't tell you. And in the very first installment of that series, I dissected a New York Times article by Aaron Carroll, who had claimed that a systematic review of the literature by the Cochrane collaboration had found that influenza vaccines confer a great public health benefit. And of course, everyone needs to get their flu shots. So you go and look up that systematic review from the Cochrane collaboration, which is an organization that specializes in what's called a meta-analysis and systematic review. So they review the literature for existing studies based on selection criteria, and then do this meta-analysis of all that conglomerate data. And so if you go and read that study that was being cited by the New York Times to support this pro-flu shot article, and in fact, what that study found was that the flu shot, the benefits are quite small. It took something like 100 healthy adults to get vaccinated to prevent one case of influenza. So the effectiveness is quite weak, especially in most years when it doesn't match the circulating virus. And the authors of that study were so critical of public health policy. Number one, they pointed out that the two fundamental assumptions of the CDC underlying its universal flu shot recommendation are unsupported by scientific evidence. That was one of their findings, that both of those assumptions, one being that that the flu shot prevents transmission, which there was no evidence to support, and then also that it reduces mortality among the elderly. also no evidence to support. In fact, we can get more into that. That's a whole other topic, um, about how that's just untrue. In fact, the opposite appears to be true. So those two assumptions were unsupported by the evidence, and they were so critical of the CDC that they literally accused the CDC of deliberately misrepresenting the science to support their policy. Okay. Point being, so that this here you got this New York Times article saying that this study says that flu shots confer a huge public health benefit. Everyone needs to get their flu shots. And you go and read the study, and it's highly critical of the CDC's policy and calls it into question entirely, and saying that it doesn't seem to be a very good idea to recommend this universally because it doesn't work. So completely opposite. And so this is a really good example to show how you have to check sources and you have to verify information for yourself. And just because they claim something, anyone can cite sources and it makes it look more reputable by citing a lot of sources. But a lot of times people cite sources and it's just bogus and they're completely mischaracterizing their sources. And this is routine. I mean, I could probably go to the New York Times homepage right now and pull up an article and pick an article and go through it and find something, an example of this, because it's so common and just routine. So you really have to be careful about that. And that's just another huge tip, to when you're researching, reading news media. And anytime you doubt something, you question something, listen to your gut, listen to your intuition, and be skeptical. The skepticism is really healthy, and check sources and verify.
We appreciate that. It seems like the citizen journalist, or when COVID was announced, lockdowns were announced, I had never been a journalist in any way, but I felt a need to pull together a conference. So Health Freedom Summit is something that I produced as just a mom, and thank you for your support in that. And so I'm asking about people who are finding themselves in a position where they have to get involved because they can't stand the misery that we're being forced to live under, and we're having to catch up into a pseudo professional domain where we're having to correct the experts, correct the media, and even Bobby Kennedy right now. There's the MAHA movement is very upset with him because he's publishing things that say the MMR vaccine is the solution to measles, and we're having to step up when the HHS director isn't telling the truth himself on this. And I would love your commentary on that and just what the movement, what the health freedom movement needs to do now in terms of correcting all the experts.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm very happy that Bobby Kennedy, that Trump upheld his promise and appointed him to Secretary of Health and Human Services. At the same time, my view has always been that the type of change we really need is not going to happen from the top down. It's not going to be that we get some super leader in the government in some position of power, and that they're going to be the one to affect all the change that we need. It's always from the bottom up, and it always has been. That's just a fact of history. That meaningful change always occurs from the bottom up, and the only thing that politicians ever have to do with that is that it's the population that makes it politically infeasible for politicians to support certain positions, and they can go on supporting criminal policies and implementing criminal policies as long as we consent to it. And that's where the manufacture of consent comes in. The lockdowns are a great example of so many people believed that the lockdowns were necessary. To this day, particularly among people who align themselves with the Democratic Party, people believe that the lockdowns worked. Never mind that the promised benefits of the lockdowns never manifested in the data. They still believe that the vaccines are safe and effective. I mean, there's these outright delusional beliefs that people have, and that's a product of the mainstream media's nature of its reporting. And so that's what we're up against. And as to the point of, as I relate to what you're talking about, how, I'm just a mom, I'm just trying to do my part and speak out, and I can't remain silent anymore. And that's my story. I'm just a dad. I wasn't when I got started. I got started, as I mentioned, after 9/11, and then I really got started writing and speaking out against the Iraq War in the months before the war. And that was just something I felt like I don't have a degree in journalism. I didn't go to school for it. I don't have that training. or in foreign policy or international relations. My degree is in communications. I was a film and video major. But I felt morally compelled after because the thing that kind of triggered me was with the events of 9/11, and I was kind of naive at that point in my life, naive enough to ask the question, why would people do this? And it was unsatisfied with the answer that it was because they hate our freedoms. And I was like, well, okay, what's the real reason? And so I started researching. I was genuinely curious. That was a time in my life I had moved to Taiwan after college and just to try to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And so I was spending a lot of time at a research at an internet cafe before I had owned a computer there. And kind of just discovered the internet and this library at my fingertips. And so I was just spending a lot of time researching and reading up and getting my information from a broad variety of sources that I had never been exposed to before. And that's how I was able to determine that the U.S. government was lying about the Iraq War. And so that's how I got started. I was just a citizen, a concerned person who just felt kind of morally compelled to, number one, to try to figure out what the truth is for myself, and then to share that knowledge with other people. And then that became something that I ended up kind of doing now full time as a career.
Oh, you're good
Um,
at it.
my son was born in 2012, and I kind of shifted my focus from foreign policy to the vaccine issue because I was just applying the research skills I developed doing journalism in foreign policy areas and also economics to making personal choices as a parent about the vaccines on the CDC schedule. And so I just dug directly into the medical literature. You can go to pubmed.gov and research the medical literature for yourself. And that's what I was doing. I wasn't just taking the CDC vaccine information statement from the pediatrician and saying, oh, there's just 2 pages of information and that's all I need to know. I mean, that's ridiculous that parents rely on two pages of information from the CDC.
Yeah.
And so I was digging deeply into the literature, and I got to a point after a number of years of doing that where, again, I was just morally compelled, where I had acquired so much knowledge about it that I could not keep it to myself.
Yeah.
I was just compelled to start writing about it, even though I knew that would put a huge target on my back, and people would question my credibility and really attack me for being quote unquote anti-vaccine, which of course I don't consider myself anti-vaccine because vaccines are just a product. If people want to choose to use them, that's their choice. I'm just pro-informed consent. But of course, to be to be an advocate of informed consent is literally described as being anti-vaccine. So it's a euphemism, meaning that you favor informed consent. And so to be pro-vaccine, then necessarily, logically, according to their own usage, means that you are opposed to the right to informed consent. You believe in forcible and coerced vaccination. So that's what pro-vaccine means in the discourse.
Right.
And so yeah, I mean, you can think of me as just a dad. You know what I mean? I'm just a father, and I research stuff for my own knowledge, and then I share that knowledge with others. And so, I mean, really, anyone can do what I'm doing. I don't think, I might have some skills and talents in some areas, but other people have skills and talents in other areas. And I think it's really important for everyone to just understand to recognize what their own unique abilities are and what their unique knowledge is, and then how best to apply that. I mean, some of us are organizers. I'm not an organizer. Some of people are just activists. The type who want to go out in the streets and march at rallies and things, or speak at rallies, or getting involved politically with petitions or contacting legislators, things like this. I mean, there's all kinds of different fronts in this information war. And so I think everyone just kind of has to find their own unique position in that and apply their skills in whatever way possible because it is all hands on deck kind of situation here that we all need to be active and doing something. A really, really important thing that I need from my followers and readers and my audience is sharing because the censorship is really it's a serious concern. And so for me to get my messages out absolutely depends on my audience sharing my articles with people. I mean, that's how I circumvent the censors. And so the simple act of sharing links and just sharing that information is a really, really important thing. And it doesn't cost any money. It just costs a moment of time, and that's a really critical thing for people to be doing. So, but as long as I think everyone needs to be active in some measure, according to their own unique capacity. Yeah.
Absolutely. You had mentioned a moment ago the internet and the, overcoming censorship, and I'd like to talk about big tech. Just this week, I posted on TikTok. I didn't even say anything. I green screened a video of Bill Gates laughing about bioweapons and how ha 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 bioweapons are the new big threat, and it was, you could kind of tell like he's excited by the proposition of bioweapons everywhere. And I didn't say a word. I just had my face in it. And TikTok took that video down because I violated community guidelines. I also read your post about LinkedIn and the censorship you had to deal with LinkedIn and getting your account back and getting posts back. And so let's talk about what it really is going to take in order to move these tech companies towards a place where free speech is a value system that they deliver.
Yeah, fortunately, there have been some very positive developments in that area. I mean, I was writing about the censorship problem pre-COVID, when to talk about it, like people would view you as some kind of tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist. To say there's censorship in the U.S. media. Come on, get out of here. You know what I mean? So I was writing about it pre-COVID, but then during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the lockdown madness, it became so overt that it became part of the public discourse that this was happening, which was great. It was incredible that finally occurred because it was well overdue for that to become a serious topic of conversation in the mainstream discourse. So that was a positive development in itself, that so now people were aware of it, that this isn't some kind of conspiracy theory. Yes, they're literally trying to censor us. Um, and then just in the last year or so, there's been a couple of developments. I mean, there's been a number of lawsuits against various parties for the censorship. Children's Health Defense has sued. A number of the states have sued the Biden administration. And Mark Zuckerberg, not too long ago, came out and number one, he's admitted on a few occasions that to the Congress that he was under pressure, that Facebook Meta was under pressure to censor on behalf of the Biden administration, and not just to censor what was determined to be, quote unquote, misinformation, but to censor factually accurate information. And he's admitted this. So that was another positive step, that he's admitting what they did. And then he just made a decision not long ago to sever ties with the so-called fact check industry, which would be like, the Pointer, what is the Pointer Institute, and the Reuters and the AP, the fact check organizations. They have this kind of conglomerate organization where they collaborate on so-called fact checking. But of course, the fact check industry is a I call it the faux fact check industry. It's a hoax. It's a scam, because what they really do is they use misinformation as a euphemism, as usual, simply meaning any information, no matter how factual, that doesn't align with the political agenda. So they're political propaganda organizations. And so the fact checking is to repress dissent and efforts to combat the mainstream government approved disinformation. So you suppress that in order to facilitate the propagation of the government approved disinformation, such as the claim that the 2 doses of the mRNA vaccines were going to confer durable sterilizing immunity that would end the pandemic by conferring herd immunity with stopping infection and transmission, which was a lie from the beginning. As I was pointing out at the time, there was no science to support that claim, but that's what all of the public health establishment was saying, from the CDC director, Anthony Fauci. President Biden claimed it. The task force, the COVID task force at the White House, they were all saying the same thing. The insurance, the healthcare providers, the state health departments, they were all lying and making the same claims that were completely unsupported by scientific evidence. And so that's government approved disinformation. They knew they were lying. Um, and so this is the purpose of the censorship and the so-called fact check organizations. So there have been some positive developments. It's great to see Facebook saying, okay, we're not going to participate in that anymore. That's a positive step. When Elon Musk took over Twitter, now X, and and he vowed to end the that type of censorship on his platform. And as far as I can tell, I mean, I don't know. I think it's probably still continuing on some level or other on both platforms. Um, but these are positive developments. At the same time, that there does remain that risk and that problem. Facebook continues still, I think, to censor and even if they're not doing it overtly, there's shadow banning and so on. And so it really is a matter of I think the lawsuits have helped kind of make these companies realize that, well, it's not a matter of, see, a lot of times you'll hear the argument that, well, they're private companies and so they can do what they want, and you agree to their terms of use. If they say you can't talk about something, then you can't talk about it, and that would be fine if we were dealing with strictly with a contractual relationship between the service provider and the user. However, here we're dealing with a situation where they're acting in service to the state. They're
Yeah.
acting on behalf of the government to promote a political agenda. And so then it brings into question free speech rights protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution, and the government's violation of the Constitution by collaborating with the so-called fact check industry and the social media companies to deliberately suppress dissent. So then it becomes a constitutional issue. And I think that's probably what has alarmed Mark Zuckerberg. And I don't think Zuckerberg had any problem at all with the censorship regime that he was collaborating in while it was underway. I think the lawsuits may have gotten to him and
Mm.
shook him up and made him realize that, okay, we're gonna change gears here. Maybe he had a change of heart and some kind of Jesus moment or something. I don't know, but I just kind of I'm skeptical that he really had. I don't think I think he had some kind of ulterior motive of changing his view and coming out and being honest about it, which I think was the fear of the lawsuits and so on. Because I think there is a case to be made there, and some of those lawsuits did have some progress towards getting some kind of justice for the censorship that was happening. In my case with LinkedIn, that's kind of how I got back my account. Was I implied, not that I would have the resources to actually sue LinkedIn, but I made it clear that they were violating their terms of use with me by blocking my content and suspending my account on false pretexts. The false pretext being that their community guidelines say that you can't post misinformation, including information that directly conflicts with that provided by public health authorities, quote unquote, public health authorities, right?
Right.
And so they use that as again as a euphemism. So if you say something, so the example is, I mean, the example that got me banned was I had shared an article where I had shown how the CDC's August 2021 claim that the vaccines confer better protection than natural immunity was contradicted at the time by virtually all of the non-CDC originating medical literature, and subsequently falsified by the CDC's own data, as reported by its own researchers in its own journal. And so my article is completely factually accurate, but I was not allowed to post that because it contradicted my claim that the CDC had lied, was not tolerated, and that's how I got banned. And so this is the situation we're faced with, and the types of repression of truth. And so it's little wonder that so many people are deceived and really kind of live in a delusion, unfortunately. They have some kind of belief about how the world works, about how the country works, how the government works, and it's really just disconnected from reality. And we all have a responsibility to help awaken people, to help them realize. And we have to be gentle with it. I mean, it's sometimes if you try to go at something head on and batter people over the head with facts and logic. A lot of times, facts and logic do not work. People have emotional reactions, and that's something we have to be mindful of. Is people's emotional attachments to their belief systems. And if
100%.
you challenge their beliefs, they become very emotional and irrational. And no amount of facts and logic or reason are going to get through to them. And so that's something we have to be sensitive of, and just kind of have some kind of strategic approach in the way that we try to approach people with the information and the knowledge.
That is exactly why we're here. I really liked in your article about LinkedIn censorship, you said that you got banned because you were a heretic against the vaccine religion,
Yes.
something along that lines. And that phrase
Yep.
was so spot on. And we talk about people, everyone has their different skills and talents. And, I went to art school. I'm very good at Photoshop. I really feel my calling here is to help with optics, to compete with the experts who have presented themselves to the public in white coats and really, great lighting and their stages and everything. And for us, normal people, the populace, we have to somehow increase our credibility to at all compete with the optics of the people who are so-called experts, and to be able to attract enough attention and to get people's defenses down to the point where they're even relaxed enough to accept a different possible perspective.
Right.
So I'm here to increase the credibility of our people who are trying
Hmm.
to share truth. And
Yes.
um, I I guess, but one thing that keeps coming up in you talk about the strategy to competing with these belief systems is people have a fear of visibility. You've got assassination attempts, and you've got doxing, and you've got humiliation. These humiliation rituals, which if you study communism, that's what they do. There's humiliation rituals. And so, can you talk about just courage? And you have taken on some demons with your articles and your books. And so, how do you approach just being courageous enough to communicate and hit?
Yeah, I guess if I can do it, anyone can. I'm actually an extreme introvert, and I really dislike the public spotlight. In fact, when I first started writing, I was writing anonymously because I didn't want my name out there. I'm a very private person. Eventually, I did start writing under my real name because I figured, well, I want people to view my articles as credible and authoritative. And how am I going to do that if I'm writing anonymously? Like people need to know who I am. And so that's kind of why I made the decision. Same thing, doing interviews and things always made me nervous. And even to this day, it's something I'm not necessarily completely comfortable with, just because of my introverted nature. Um, and I honestly just do not like being in the public spotlight. It's something that I do because I have to. It's a responsibility and a duty. It's just kind of part of it's kind of part of the job. The part of the job description of what I do. And although I prefer kind of, in my writing, I can kind of put my thoughts out there, in this faceless way. And so that's why I kind of mainly consider myself a writer more than anything else. But yeah, it's just something that I've kind of had to learn to do, learning to grow a thick skin, dealing with the personal attacks. I used to be very sensitive about that type of thing. And but you kind of have to just get your toes wet at first, and then you can wade further into the water as you go, and kind of, yeah, I mean, I don't, it does take courage, yeah, it does take courage to put yourself in a position, like when I first started, as I mentioned, my son was born in 2012. I don't think I ever published an article about the vaccine issue until maybe 2017, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but it was quite a few years um, before I felt comfortable putting myself out there on that issue. And what it took for me was just building up a sufficient level of knowledge that I felt confident in my knowledge. It's where where I knew I could anticipate what the counter arguments would be. And that's the level of knowledge I think that people need to get to be able to have the confidence. And so that's kind of what I try to do is I try to build people's confidence to speak out, to stand up and speak out, by giving them the knowledge that they need and giving them the arguments that they're going to need, to answer the challenges they're going to be faced with. But most of the time, most of the time when you're attacked, they won't even present an argument. They'll call you names or insult you. But what they don't do is they don't identify your factual errors or your logical errors. And they don't present any counter arguments. And so that's just, you kind of have to learn which type of people are worth even responding to and confronting. And also, a lot of times people, I get into these debates on Twitter or wherever, and sometimes people will be like, well, why are you wasting your time like arguing with these trolls? They're not worth your time. And my response is always, well, I'm not doing it for the sake of the trolls. I'm not trying to change the mind of this person who's attacking me for sharing this article with all these facts in it. I'm doing it because there's other people watching. It's for the benefit of all the bystanders who are viewing this debate, because some of them will have an open mind. And yeah, I'm never going to get through to the person who is attacking me, but some of the people reading that thread, I can
Yes.
get through to some of them. And that's why I'm doing it. And those actually can be really beneficial for people to witness, like, okay, he's presenting this argument, but Jeremy is saying this, and well, Jeremy's argument is stronger, or Jeremy showed how that guy's facts are wrong, and so then that's kind of a way to get through to a wider audience. Is I'm not doing it because I expect to change the mind of the trolls. It's for the benefit of others viewing the conversation. And yeah, I mean it can be challenging. In fact, I did a survey. Interestingly, I did a survey among my readers a while back,
I love
just
surveys.
just on social media use. I kind of wanted to understand how my readers were using social media, and I was pretty surprised to find that most of my readers uh, weren't active on social media for the purpose of activism. I mean, they might use social media to, share pictures of cats or whatever, but they weren't out there like being active in terms of sharing knowledge and spreading information and getting the truth out.
Mm,
And so one of the questions for people who answered that they weren't active in that way, I had a number of, I had a question about like what were the reasons why. And I mean that was a big one was, like afraid of losing friends,
yeah.
family, afraid of personal attacks, afraid of, how they're going to come across, feeling that it would be pointless because it's just going to be censored anyways was another one. So
Yes.
there were quite a variety of obstacles that people view to um, making this decision to be active in this way on social media. And it was really insightful. I'm glad I did that survey. It was kind of helpful to see what the obstacles and challenges are, because by knowing that, it kind of helped me to kind of develop a strategy to urge people and build people's confidence and encourage them to make that step. I think it's really, really important for people to be active in one way or another. And and you don't have to do it. You can do it anonymously, like I started out, if it's more comfortable for you. Some people, I understand, you may have a job where you could threaten your job. You
Yes.
could lose your job for speaking out. And I'm certainly not going to judge anyone for remaining silent, given certain circumstances. I mean, everyone has their own unique
Situation.
life circumstances. That no judgment here. But at the same time, I do think it is important to determine what you can do and to take some action in some way.
I'd like to just, for people listening, I observed myself in your, I guess you could call it marketing funnel, but it with the Brief History of Palestine book, the short book, that is an issue that I have put my head in the sand and I have like la 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 la. I didn't want to get into it because it was because of relationships, and if I have too strong of an opinion either way, who am I going to be alienating? And so if I
Right.
just avoid it, then I don't have to be accountable to, there's no responsibility if you just didn't know about it. Ignorance is bliss kind of situation.
Hmm.
And you created a short book that was respectful of my time as a beginner. You it it was free, so you put your email in. It was valuable in exchange for my email address, and then I got the opportunity to instantly read it, and then I would be safe, and I'm like in my house, totally safe in private, and I can consider the opinions without anybody judging me, without anybody yelling at me, and looking stupid because I don't know all the facts. And so I was able to like consider your ideas in this safe place with a book, and you immediately, like page one, addressed, like you said, the number one objections, like what are the number one arguments in my identity as a Christian. You went, I don't want to violate God's will. I don't want to be like not in alignment with biblical principles, and so you immediately went there. And I just think anybody who's considering like how do you present controversial information to the world for people who are on the fence. That process that you moved me through was spot on and perfect, and people should consider mimicking it. So good job on that
Well,
front.
I really appreciate that feedback. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad that makes me extraordinarily happy to hear that. And just for your knowledge, I was raised Christian, so I come from that background, and so that was kind of, I've studied the Bible back in the day, probably in my, late high school, early young adulthood, intensely studied the Bible, and so I do have that background, and I think that helps on this issue because it is so deeply. And this goes to that point I was speaking earlier about how people have this emotional attachment to their belief systems, and so that's something that obviously the Holy Land is an intensely controversial topic, just based on people's beliefs, religious beliefs, and so yeah, I try to be respectful about the differing belief systems, but at the same time, challenging in some ways certain beliefs.
Yeah.
So, but mainly just on the facts of history, as opposed to religious beliefs. But yeah, but at the same time, in that book, I have to challenge certain religious beliefs as well because it was unavoidable due to the nature of the evidence with archaeology and DNA studies and so on. But hopefully, I was able to navigate that without offense to people who who have strong religious beliefs.
Absolutely. And I think the gentle approach of it, you can stay relaxed when you consume information from you, whereas some people are very vitriolic and yell, I don't want to be yelled at. Who wants to be yelled at? You know,
Right.
nobody. So can this is kind of the MAHA crowd, so if we can talk about some other goals of our movement and the health freedom movement in terms of like if you could direct everybody's energy to accomplishing one goal in terms of achieving informed consent and moving the needle
Mhm.
forward and accomplishing
Mhm.
one big task, what would you have us all do?
I think the issue that comes immediately to mind when you ask that question is the COVID-19 vaccines for children being on the CDC schedule. That is not acceptable. And say what you will about the schedule, the rest of the childhood schedule. The fact that you have still to this day, and this is a thing, I think the media constantly lie about this, that they will say that those products are approved. For children under 12, they are not FDA approved.
To this day.
To this day, they're still being administered under emergency use authorization. Well, what's the emergency? Children in that age range, they're not at risk of COVID-19. They have a very low risk from COVID-19. There's no emergency. And, the EUA status is specifically for products that are still considered experimental or investigational. There is no clinical trial data for children in this age range from 6 months to 11-year-olds. No clinical trial data.
Yeah.
And the way that they got them approved for, or not approved, authorized for emergency use was scientific fraud. I have an ebook on that as well, how the FDA utilized outright scientific fraud to get those authorized, where they used, in one of the aspects of that fraud was what they call immunobridging data, where they took like antibody levels from adolescents and adults who had had the vaccine, and they compared antibody responses with younger children, and so they're basically claiming that, well, if you have an antibody response of such and such a level of antibodies in your blood, whatever the titer is, and then therefore you're protected, and that's fraudulent. They haven't proven a correlation between a specific antibody titer and protection. They haven't established that correlation in the science. And of course, it completely overlooks the importance of cellular immunity. And that's one of the reasons why children are better protected from COVID-19 than adults, is because of their superior cellular immune responses, which is separate from the antibody responses. It's the T cells. And so people, and in fact, the correlation is actually the opposite when you look at people who have severe COVID-19. And this was known right from the beginning, right from like March 2020 on through until the vaccines received their authorization, to study after study after study showing that actually the correlation is that people who had severe COVID-19 had higher levels of antibodies. And people who were asymptomatic, who didn't even develop the disease, they had an infection, but they never developed the disease, had very low levels of antibodies. So how do you explain that? Well, it's precisely because the people who did very well and never even developed the disease had such strong cellular immune responses.
Mm,
And so that's an aspect of the fraud here. And so I think that's a huge issue. And I think that Bobby Kennedy really needs to be pushed on that topic
got it.
because as far as I know, I haven't seen him talk about it. And you know, he's talking about getting toxins out of foods and things like that. But I mean, I think we all need to push him to doing something about the COVID-19. I mean, that's a good place to start. I mean, we have to address other aspects of the schedule
Yeah.
for certain. But like, I think we need to focus on one particular thing. And I think that's kind of like the low-hanging fruit. Because again, if people understand that those vaccines are not even FDA approved for children under 12.
Yeah.
That's something that people need to understand. And I think if you can kind of address people's cognitive dissonance on that one point and get through to them about like, okay, they didn't do clinical trials with children. There are no clinical trials with children in that age range. They didn't do them. So we have no data from clinical trials. So it's an experimental use of an mRNA gene therapy product on young children. And I think that's just such a critically important point to hammer home and to address, and an issue to really face and confront. So if I was going to pick one thing, I think that would be an area that we could really focus on
Um,
and try to get some progress in.
this is a great answer. Bravo. I was going to move on to audience questions, but you've just brought up something that we got to get to it. I can't let you leave without asking you this. You talk about everything shifting towards food. There's been rumors that Casey and Callie Means are infiltrators who are hijacking the conversation towards food so that we don't talk about vaccines. There's what's her name? Olivia Nuzzi and Jessica Mann. There's some kind of scandal with sexting and stuff with Bobby Kennedy. Can you talk about infiltrators and how we can identify them, protect ourselves from them, like not let ourselves get distracted with different topics? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean sometimes just the accusation of infiltration can become a distraction in and of itself. But yeah, I mean that's a really good point in question. As far as Casey and Kelly Means, I don't know. I don't really follow them much. I just don't know what's going on there with them. I've seen them say things that I agree with. They seem to be on point and on message. As far as what I've seen, so I don't know. I can't really speak to that. But it is, you know, a lot of times. Here's kind of the way I put it. Sometimes you have certain people in the movement who behave in such a way as that they might not be infiltrators, but they might as well be
Mm,
because their actions harm the movement and the claims they make harm the movement, and they really discredit the movement as a whole with putting out bad information or misdirections or constantly deflecting from the issues that we need to be focused on, and they become kind of a distraction. And I'm not naming names or anything here. I'm just bringing that up. And so I don't know. I think in terms of how to identify someone who might be an infiltrator, well, again, I won't name a name here, but I can think back to during the lockdowns, and there was someone who had kind of gotten into the networks I was involved in, my networks of people in the health freedom movement, including leadership of the movement. And he was a doctor, and uh, I came to the conclusion that he was basically an infiltrator. He wanted to get in good with the movement, and so he was kind of being friendly to people in the movement and getting in good with them, and becoming invited to become these part of these networks and so on. But at the same time, he was messaging that COVID-19 vaccine mandates were okay with him, and he was advocating that. And so when I saw that, I was like, okay, well, that's completely, how can you say you're part of this health freedom movement when you're advocating, mandatory use of these experimental products? And so I kind of, I mean, that my spidey senses went up at that point, and I kind of drew the conclusion that he's not being genuine with people, and he's not in the movement really to be part of the movement, but to infiltrate, get information from the inside to be able to use it against us, and so on and so forth. Um, and I don't know, maybe my conclusion was off, but it just kind of, you have to, I guess, assess what they're saying and what their message is. And there were so many contradictions in this individual's messaging, like outright just self-contradictions, because he'll say he's for health freedom, but then he's advocating mandates. Okay, well, that's an irreconcilable self-contradiction. So when you start seeing that type of behavior, I mean, that's a big red flag, I would say.
Yeah, well said. Um, we one of our MAHA school members who couldn't join the live call, she wanted me to ask you. She says, "I'm curious about the reports of the two U.S. children dying from measles. Did they die of the measles or from medical malpractice? And also, for those of us who support natural immunity, how can we best respond to news like that?"
Yeah, well, Children's Health Defense investigated the first death supposedly from measles. At the time, when that death was first reported, and I went to the press release from the government, from the state, um, and they didn't actually say that. They said that the child had been hospitalized, had been diagnosed with measles, and died. So this naturally raises the question, as we all know from the whole COVID-19 scam of how the PCR tests were used to perpetrate systematic scientific fraud in the counting of COVID-19 cases. So, I think there's kind of more awareness of how this type of fraud occurs. So my immediate question was, okay, well, the child died, but was with measles, but did the child die from measles? And I had posted on my social media and I said, well, we need to be asking ourselves this question. And then Children's Health Defense did an investigation. They got the medical records of the child. Um, and they had Pierre Corey look at the records and other experts, including as I understand, one of the treating doctors of the child, who also agrees with Pierre Corey's assessment that it was medical error.
Yeah, Ben
The
Edward.
child died from medical error. The child should have survived, should have been given appropriate antibiotics, because the child did not die from measles virus per se. It was bacterial pneumonia, because bacterial infections can be co-infections with measles virus. It's very common. But then, of course, they attribute the death to the measles virus. But that was not the opinion of these medical experts. That no, it was actually number one, it was bacterial pneumonia, and the child should not have died from pneumonia. They should have been given proper antibiotic treatment, and they weren't. They were mistreated, and so it was medical malpractice or medical error, essentially, is
So
how they attributed the death. The second death, I don't know. It just came out in the news that Bobby Kennedy had gone to the funeral of a second child who died supposedly from measles. I'm skeptical. I mean, they're reporting 450 cases in this outbreak. It's a very small number of cases. Um, it'd be very surprising to see, and we already know about the first death, but even assuming that the first death was supposedly from measles, so there's two children now that have died supposedly from measles. Out of 450 reported cases, that's not right. I mean, just statistically speaking, I mean, the CDC claims this is one of the lies the CDC tells, that the death rate from measles is 1 in 1,000. So for every 1,000 children infected with measles, we can expect one of them to die. However, we have 2 out of 450. Well, that's unusual, right? Just statistically speaking. And beyond that, the 1 in 1,000 claim is an outright brazen lie, because we know from the pre-vaccine era that the fatality rate from measles was actually closer to 1 in 10,000. The CDC exaggerates it by an order of magnitude. And the way they get away with that is that they report the case fatality rate, which is the number of deaths per reported cases, as the infection fatality rate, which is the number of deaths per estimated infections.
uh,
So it's the CFR versus the IFR. And so they pass off the CFR as though it were an IFR, which is scientific fraud, again. And every journalist who considers themselves a health or science journalist knows better, but they still pass off the CDC's claim as though it were an infection fatality rate. And it's not. You can go into the literature, it's uncontroversial. The estimated fatality rate before the vaccine was 1 in 10,000, not 1 in 1,000. And so if it actually is the case today where 1 in 1,000 infections results in measles death, well, there's something wrong with children's immune systems in that case, in which case we have to look directly at the role of vaccines.
Mhm.
But just going on the pre-vaccine era data, we know it was 1 in 10,000. So here we have two supposed deaths out of 450 reported cases. That right there calls into question the credibility of the reporting about these deaths and whether they actually died from measles as opposed to with measles.
Good answer. So second part of her question was, how should we respond to the media misreporting all this? What's your favorite way to hit them back?
Well, every time, and it's just almost like obligatory that the media will say, they repeat the 1 in 1,000. 1 in 1,000, one child dies for every 1,000 infected. That's a lie. And every time you see that, you got to get out there and just hammer that home that that's a lie. And I can provide resources for that. In fact, if you go to my website and you go to my navigation and you can go to articles, and then I have a collections page. And you go to the collections page, and one of the collections I have there is a number of different articles on measles, and I cover that quite extensively, that particular lie. In fact, one of my articles is uh, the title of the article is related to how the CDC lies about the measles fatality rate. And I have a number of articles on that, but you'll be able to find that easily. Um, and there you'll get all the sources you need to be able to debunk this lie. In fact, you can go into the CDC's own, what's called the Pink Book, which is its book on infectious diseases. It's document. And they say right in there, they provide the data of the number of in the pre-vaccine era, how many deaths there were, and then what the reported cases were. But then they say, but most cases weren't reported. And so they estimate that actually between like 4 to 5 million cases actually occurred a year, and infections occurred per year. And so that should be the denominator.
Yeah.
That's the infection fatality rate is maybe it was 3 to 4 million. I forget the numbers, but the 3 to 4 million, not the number of reported cases, which was much, much less. And of course they played that same scientific fraud during the lockdowns when they were saying that, the WHO came out early and saying that the fatality rate from COVID-19 was 3.4%.
Yeah.
Outrageous lie, completely false. The Imperial College London report that came out that was kind of the impetus that the governments, UK and the US and other governments cited as justification for the lockdowns. They estimated a fatality rate of like 0.9%, also way overestimated. Anthony Fauci went before Congress and said that the fatality rate from SARS-CoV-2 from COVID-19 was 10 times that of the flu. And in each of these cases, they're playing this trick of citing CFRs as though it was an IFR.
Right.
The case fatality rate of reported cases as though it was the rate of deaths per estimated infections. And so, of course, you had the one of the first studies out of California, Dr. Bhattacharya, now head of NIH, and one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. He was involved in this study of actually trying to estimate, well, how many infections have there been in one of the counties or a number of counties in California, and so they reported their findings of very high rates of infection, which means that of course the fatality rate was much, much lower than what was being reported. And of course, they were attacked and censored for reporting that, just like they were attacked and censored for the Great Barrington Declaration of opposing lockdowns and advocating a strategy of focused protection. But anyway, so things like every time you see one of these lies, the 1 in 1,000 fatality rate for measles, or what's the other one that every single article they talk about it. Um, I forget what I'm thinking of, but they have certain talking points
Right.
that they repeat in every single article. And every time they produce one of these lies, we have to be out there en masse challenging it and debunking it. And because it's so easy to debunk, because you can go, again, you can just cite the CDC's own pink book to debunk that one.
Right.
So it's very easy to do.
Awesome.
And so this is what we need to be doing. It's just like, they have these very brazen lies. We don't need to go into like the very controversial stuff even. Like just stick to what's uncontroversial. It's uncontroversial that in the pre-vaccine era, the death rate was 1 in 10,000. Completely uncontroversial. So let's just stick with what's uncontroversial and combat them on that. And I think that's one of the most effective things we can do.
Well said. I like that a lot. Um, lie, correct the record. All of
Yep.
us. Get busy in the comment section. I wanted to open up for people who came and they wanted the chance to ask Jeremy a question. This is your official invitation to unmute yourself and ask whatever it is that you would like. Um, who wants to be brave? John wants to be brave. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Alana. And thank you, Jeremy. This is extremely worthwhile to listen to you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you if you've paid much attention. I wanted to ask you if you've paid much attention to Gert Vanden Bosch and what your evaluation of what he's been saying is.
I'm sorry, who is that?
Gert Vanden Bosch?
Oh, yeah, the guy who was saying how the mass vaccination during the pandemic will result in essentially a more.
He's still saying it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of merit to that argument, and we know that for example, vaccination with what's called a leaky vaccine, which is a vaccine that does not stop infection or transmission, can cause the pathogen to evolve into a more virulent form. So the natural path of a new pathogen, some novel virus entering the human population, the natural path would be towards less virulence, so less severe disease over time, not more. And it can grow to be more transmissible, so more infectious, but then the disease itself is modified and moderated to be less severe. And that's just kind of the normal
I
path in
think
evolution.
there's some controversy about that. I'm not sure,
It's not always the case, but that's just typical. And so what he was saying was that by mass vaccinating, at least as far as I understood his arguments, I may don't quote me on this, but as far as I understand his arguments, that basically the mass vaccinating during a pandemic situation can result in the virus actually becoming more virulent over time.
not exactly, not exactly.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah,
He's saying
clarify.
it will evolve in such a way as to become deadly for the people who were primarily for the people who were vaccinated.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that is an important distinction. Um, well, and I believe that's the case because you have there were many studies coming out for a while showing negative effectiveness for vaccinated people who received the COVID-19 vaccines. In other words, they were more likely to be infected with SARS-CoV-2 than people who didn't receive the vaccine. So negative effectiveness. But this was studies looking kind of at more longer term data. So the vaccines do appear, at least according to the observational data, which we ought to be skeptical about just because of it's observational. It's not from a clinical randomized control trial, right? And there's all kinds of selection biases, including one called healthy user bias when you're looking at observational data, where people who get the vaccine tend to be healthier than people who don't. And an example of this was with the flu. I mentioned this earlier, actually, I alluded to it with the flu shots. And the CDC would claim that the flu shots protect elderly people from death. But they were citing studies where it wasn't the case, and reanalysis confirmed this, that it wasn't the case that elderly people who received the flu shot were less likely to die, but rather people who were so sick and frail that they were likely to soon die were less likely to get the flu shot. Same thing with the MMR autism debate. You have a situation where there's this healthy user bias where it's not the case that children who receive the MMR vaccine are no more likely or less likely to develop autism, but that children who have a genetic susceptibility or who are more likely to develop autism, parents they see that maybe an older sibling was vaccinated and developed autism. So with younger siblings, they skip the shot. Or maybe they say early signs of neurodevelopmental disorders, early symptoms, and they're concerned that the shot could exacerbate those types of symptoms, and so they skip the shot. And so you have this pooling of more susceptible people into the quote unquote unvaccinated cohort. So this is an example of healthy user bias. So just as a caveat to the data, we ought to be skeptical of the observational studies. But what they do show is that early on there is protection from for a short while from infection. That wanes very rapidly. And so that's why we all know that the vaccines do not stop the spread of the virus, because the duration of sterilizing immunity is very short, like weeks, maybe a couple months. And then there's a period where they are protected. People do seem to, at least again, according to the observational data, which we have to be skeptical about, there is protection against severe disease. And so when they first admitted that they don't stop infection or transmission, that's what then they relied on was, well, but you can still get the shot and you'll still be protected against hospitalization and death. But then looking at longer term, looking several months, like between 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months, looking out further, they were finding that not only do the vaccines not prevent infection, but there's negative effectiveness, meaning you're more likely to be infected. And so that to me is an indication of perhaps what Gert has been talking about. Not necessarily, there's other possible explanations for that observation. I'm fond of the hypothesis of original antigenic sin, which we know that's proven with the COVID-19 vaccines. There's this immunological phenomena known as original antigenic sin. Sometimes they call it immune imprinting, which is a really lousy name, because anytime you're challenged with some kind of immune challenge or a pathogen, there's going to be some kind of imprinting of your immune system. So it's always immune imprinting. But in this specific case, what happens is that the initial imprinting prejudices your response to that pathogen for the rest of your life. And so by imprinting the immune system with this suboptimal immunity, as the COVID-19 vaccines confer suboptimal immunity, it's much less robust and durable than natural immunity. And so we have to view natural immunity as an opportunity cost of vaccination. This is really important. So opportunity cost is a term that comes from economics, where, if you spend $1 on one thing, that's $1 you don't have anymore to spend on something else. So you have to consider your opportunity costs. And the same thing, if you get the vaccine, you are depriving yourself of the opportunity to develop superior natural immunity. And so that's another factor here at play that I think helps to explain this phenomenon in these observations, that people who have gotten the vaccine, they're mounting these immune responses. They're fixated on, well, especially early with the original vaccines, and they were the antigen component was, the mRNA was supposed to cause your cells to produce the spike protein of the original Wuhan strain of the virus. And then people's immune systems were becoming fixated on that extinct strain. And so they'd get infected with a different variant, and they'd be producing the spike protein for that extinct Wuhan strain, which isn't effective. The antibodies don't match very well. And so there was a mismatch. Whereas with natural immunity, it's your immune response is adaptive, and the antibodies might start out being produced with immune memory to the spike protein of an earlier strain that you were infected with. Upon reinfection, there's a new strain you're infected with, or a new variant. But the immune system can adapt quickly, and so it starts producing antibodies that bind better. And also another thing with the superiority of natural immunity is not only, of course, about antibodies. You have the broader range of, develop antibodies also to the nucleocapsid protein, the membrane protein. It's not just about the spike, unlike with the vaccines. And also they get the broader T cell responses as well. And so there's a lot of immunological things at play with these kind of observations and these phenomena. But so I can't say, I don't know whether his theory has been proven to be accurate or true, but I think there's a lot to it. I think it's something that, is worth listening to and being aware of. And it's something that certainly I was, people should have been alarmed by and been listening to him back at the time when he first started speaking out about it. And so I don't know the answer to whether his predictions have proven true because there are other possible explanations for some of these observations. But yeah, my perception is that it's something definitely we need to take seriously and consider seriously.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, John, for your question. It's important to me that we wrap up at the 90-minute mark, a 90-minute interview, which means we have 15 minutes to go. If any of you guys have a question for Jeremy, now is your last chance. Any questions?
Can people unmute themselves? I don't know how that works.
Yeah, you would have to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. A lot of people, you make them nervous, Jeremy. It's because you're too smart. Oh my gosh. Nicholas.
Here we go.
Great having you on, and it was very interesting information. I just have a general question. Maybe others can benefit too. Like, what can we do? What can we do with? Is there anything actionable that we can kind of tweak or something easy, just that we can all just do our part? Spread the information. I mean, is there anything you kind of thought we could all take action in a certain way to kind of mobilize spreading this information? Or I don't know, have you thought about that before?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways to mobilize. I mean, I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, just one of the most important things is to help with the combating the government-approved disinformation, right? Like the 1 in 1,000 claim with measles deaths. I mean, there's so many of these claims that the mainstream media just repeat them habitually. And a lot of them, just they shouldn't be allowed to stand. We cannot allow it to stand. It's so intolerable that they make these claims that are so ridiculously false and so easily disproven, and yet it's over and over and over again. And I think we just, yeah, anytime you see an opportunity to jump in a conversation and interject some truth. I mean, I think that's a really important thing right there that you could do, if you're on social media. And I understand the hesitancy to get involved in topics on social media that are viewed as controversial. But I think, I think it's important to at least give it a try for people who have never tried before and never wanted to be involved in those types of public discussions. I think it's important to take that first step. As I mentioned earlier, you at least get your feet wet, and then you can always wade in further as you go. But yeah, and in terms of kind of more organized mobilization, I mean, there are different angles to go at an issue from, right? And so I think that's kind of something where everyone has their own kind of unique viewpoints and perspectives or priorities and so on. And so I think people who share similar priorities in sets of knowledge and things like that, kind of can gravitate towards each other. And then kind of you kind of find who those people are. You see other people who are kind of like saying the same things you are, or they share your point of view on something, or they're trying to tackle an issue from the same angle you're going at it from. And then you can kind of group up, when you kind of identify those people out there. And I think that would be an effective approach is kind of like find out who is out there, who's kind of approaching the topic from the same angle that you are. And then, you can kind of maybe develop some kind of more organized collaboration in terms of like, let's strategize together or something like that. That might be a step you could take. But I mean, really, honestly, I think one of the single most important things we can do is just sharing the knowledge and addressing and confronting the mainstream media misinformation and disinformation. I think that's just super important. And that's something that really anyone can do. And again, and don't even get into you don't even have to get into like the controversial things. You can stick to what's completely non-controversial. And I think that's really important. And that adds to your credibility as well. I mean, we really have to be really credible and be very careful about sharing information if like you haven't like gone through the process of verifying it. I mean, a lot of times you see an art, I see people all the time, there's an article that kind of aligns with their point of view on something and they immediately share it. But actually, even though maybe the message is like, okay, maybe it's kind of like a message of pro-informed consent and so on, and we like the message, but actually the facts are wrong, and that hurts us rather than helps us. If we're sharing information that actually is not credible, that actually does have factual errors in it, or is employing logical fallacies, like we have to be careful about that. So be really careful and choosy about what you do share. So take the time to vet it a little bit. You have to do some vetting. And, of course, you're trusting on the journalists and other people who are producing the content to do that vetting process for you. But we can't, as we talked about earlier, we can't let other people tell us what to think. We do have to go through that process of if at least checking the information to see, do a little assessment of how credible and verifiable is it. And so I think that's an important part of the process. But that will give you the confidence. By doing that, then you'll get, okay, I can share this with confidence and then go for it.
I have something to
I have a
contribute.
question. Oh, can I
Oh,
ask a question? Uh, I wanted to ask, Alana is somebody who has put her own life on the line to be able to make sure that people like you have a platform and a stage. And I'm just wondering, because you have seen the front lines, as well as she has, I'm wondering what are some things that we can be doing with somebody who has personally faced legal charges against her life, but still continues to persist in putting her in jeopardizing her own freedoms. What are some things that we can be doing to enable her and give her and support her and give her a platform using some of the principles and values that you promote in your book?
Um, well, I suppose that would depend on individual circumstance, but if it's legal challenges and legal threats that the person is faced with, then that might require a legal team and getting some legal advice. Um, but I think generally, I'm concerned about this as, when I wrote The War on Informed Consent, I was, is Richard Pan going to try to sue me for what I say about him? Is the Oregon Medical Board going to try to come after me now, with some kind of legal actions? But I just trying to be as truth is an absolute defense against like libel claims and things. So I just try to be as accurate as possible, and that's kind of how I try to protect myself is just being number one honest. So if I do make a mistake, I acknowledge it and correct it, and that's one thing for me as a journalist. I can only speak in terms of answering this question. I can kind of really only speak from my own experience and perspective. So I'm kind of doing that from a point of view as a journalist who kind of puts himself out there. I'm just being really, really careful about what I say and making sure that I can back it up and that I'm factually accurate. And again, as I mentioned, if I do make a mistake, I will acknowledge and correct it. But as far as protection against, and I've never faced a legal threat such as what you're describing, fortunately. It's something, of course, I worry about. Unfortunately, I've never faced one. But I suppose if I were to face, somebody threatening to sue me or something, or coming after me in that way, that's where I would probably want to be getting some legal counsel, which I could not provide.
thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Michael. Some of the battles that we face are in private, and they're very expensive, and they just drain all the energy out of you. Yeah, my situation was a custody situation, which I've been a little bit public about, but not very public about. But the family courts, if you don't vaccinate and you're in the family court system, it is awful.
Yeah.
It is awful.
Okay. Oh, thank you for that context. Yeah, I was not aware of the context there. So, yeah, I've seen a number of just reports of, one parent taking the child away and then vaccinating them against the will of the other parent. And it's always so tragic whenever I see those types of cases and situations. And that's something, yeah, I don't have any expertise in that area.
Colorado just passed a law saying that you don't have a right to affirm or to for gender to affirm a child's gender, and that you as a parent can risk losing custody of your children if you attempt to identify their gender in any way. That just happened in Colorado a couple
Wow.
days ago.
Wow.
So these, using children as weapons against your cause is becoming the new norm.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly going after parents who choose not to vaccinate. Um, and I've faced nothing to that. I mean, my wife and I have a good relationship, and we are both we don't have that problem. But we have faced persecution and prejudice as parents who choose not to vaccinate. Being expelled from the pediatrics office, um, being discriminated. My son being discriminated against by our own family members, my extended family. My family on my side. Things like this. Dealing with just the persecution of it. As someone who's outspoken and about my views, and I used to kind of conceal my son's vaccination status, but I got to a point where I kind of like, well, I think it's really important for people to know that my son is completely unvaccinated and he's healthy. I kind of got to a point where I kind of felt like comfortable publicly disclosing that information because I think it was really important because that's one of the key points of my book, The War on Informed Consent, is that the data show the data that we have, the best of it, shows that unvaccinated children are healthier.
Mhm.
And that's such a critical point. And I kind of felt a bit of a responsibility to kind of disclose that publicly that yeah, my son is completely unvaccinated. So obviously that puts a huge target on my back. Um, but I just try to cover our bases. I just learned here in Michigan that there's something called an immunization waiver form that the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services claims you have to sign if you want to get your son or your child into a public school, which would include charter schools and things. As long as they receive government funding, they're considered public school. And I always thought that was the case, that if we wanted to, we've always homeschooled, and so I always thought if we wanted to put him in any kind of public school, even if it was privately owned, that we would have to get the immunization waiver form. And I just learned that that's not the case at all. In fact, that's not what the law in Michigan says at all. And you can look up the public health code, and it says that the parent can write their own waiver, and they just exempt themselves, and they say I cannot meet the requirements due to whatever objection. It could be religious or other objection to the vaccinations. And so the parent writes the waiver saying exempting themselves and gives it to the school administration. That's it. It doesn't involve the state. There's no state involvement according to the law in Michigan. And so, this is one of the things, like, how could I not, all these years we've been homeschooling, and I always thought that parents who do want to go put their children in the school system have to get this waiver. Actually, it's not true. People just do it because that's what the Department of Health and Human Services says. But that's just a regulation and a rule that this executive agency came up with that contradicts what the law says and violates the law. So they're essentially trying to implement a new law, but of course the executive agency has no law-making authorities, so it's completely unconstitutional. But there's all kinds of issues like this where they claim the law says something, and it's completely untrue. The law doesn't actually say that, and so. This is where we need the lawyers and the attorneys among us to help out and deal with these things. And I learned about that, fortunately, from we have an organization here called Michigan for Vaccine Choice, who had done all that work of hiring the lawyers to give these analyses, these legal analyses, and going through the law and identifying what the law says versus the claims about it. And so I was able to use that as a resource. And so. That's something, look for those types of organizations in your state, reach out to them. They might be able to put you in touch with lawyers, legal teams, to help identify like what types of lawyers might be involved in this space, who maybe you could reach out to. I think those types of organizations are really, really critical.
I just want to piggyback on that for my kids. First of all, congratulations on having the intuition to do your due diligence on your first kid. It took me until my third. My third does not have vaccines, but unfortunately, my first and second do. And my third child is the healthiest. She has no chronic issues whatsoever. So congratulations. I admire you for your foresight.
Thank you.
Also, on the Nicholas, I have some things to contribute to your comment about what do we do. in the context of my kids' school, I engaged with my kids they went to the same magnet school, and just like Jeremy said, there was this, like, the thought was that all kids had to get their vaccines in order to attend school. But if you actually look at the law, that's not what the actual law said. But nobody had challenged my kids' school before on this. So I was the first, and I got in a toughie with the principal and the school nurse and then the superintendent. And the nurse told me, well, you have to get your kids vaccinated, otherwise they can't attend. And I said, oh, no, I don't. And I said, and I'll involve my state senator on this if you think I'm wrong about it. And I was confident, which is part of the game. Just exuding confidence, like you're actually the one who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And I got what I wanted. And the principal apologized to me, which was great. And another thing that people can do in terms of like local politics, Stand for Health Freedom, which I think it's standforhealthfreedom.com. They have a really easy system where you can get informed about the acts and the bills that are kind of like on the docket that need involvement, and it's really easy to inscript yourself into it and get involved and send out the letters and email all your people in your county or your jurisdiction, so that your local lawmakers will get some type of signal and pressure point to vote the right way. That's another thing that you can do that I think is really easy. And then I just have to add this too before we close. I did a podcast episode. If you go to the Speaker Salon, one of the more recent podcast episodes I did was about reprogramming the subconscious. And you know, people need to be physically, like if you look at the science behind it, people need to be physically relaxed in order for their brain to to be reprogrammed, so that we can accept new information. So reading a book like Jeremy's book, I was relaxed and I was able to receive new information. Films are even more powerful in terms of just relaxing people so that they can accept a new idea. And so I was working with Andy Wakefield for to helping people for them to start film screenings for 1986 The Act. And you can do this with any film. If you can organize, like maybe once a year or once a month, you bring a film. These people work really hard on their films, and there's enough filmmakers now that are doing quality work, quality documentaries. You can bring a film to your community, or you can organize a watch party online where you in a friendly way, invite everybody and be like, hey, you guys, this movie really impacted me. I'm organizing a watch party on such and such a date. This, you're important to me and I'd love for you to make it. And then let the film do the heavy lifting of convincing the people. And when they're in that state of relaxation, you're friendly, you're not antagonistic, you're not yelling at them, then they can consider new ideas that, in a safe way. And that's it. That's all I had to contribute to that question.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point about not being antagonistic. I mean, against the trolls, yeah, fine. Go pull out, take the gloves off against those types. But, against like the onlookers and other people who you genuinely want to get through to, I think that's just a critical point. If you make them raise their guard and put up that wall, you'll never get through to them. So you kind of have to get them to lower their guard and just be open and receptive to the information. And that's a real challenge, but that's a really good point about how to go about doing that.
You're welcome, Tammy. I see in the chats. I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to say. We're over the 90-minute mark. I guess, Jeremy, I am so grateful that you took time out of your day to be with us, and I'm a big fan. You're doing great. Keep up the good work, and we're cheering for you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And yeah, any last questions? It's fine that we're going over. It's okay with me. But it looks like nobody has any more questions. So, okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity and this opportunity to kind of connect with your community here. It's great.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
Thank you for the questions.
Yes, thank you guys for being
Oh,
here.
very much.
You're welcome. This is being recorded. It's going to live inside of MAHA School. The point of MAHA School, I have a branding background in business, and I'm helping thought leaders and people who want to be more active in this movement to improve their personal brand, be effective at digital marketing, and just be a little support group for people who are trying to break through the lies. So thank you guys for being here, and have a great week. God bless.
Take care.
Bye, guys.